There was a recent statement by Tony Fratto, who's a White House spokesman, who was rambling on, I think maybe on NPR, I'm not sure, but it was a long interview, and a few people caught his inadvertent acknowledgement that they were planning this bailout plan some time ago. Right. So it seems to be similar to the Patriot Act in that way. You know, the Patriot Act was all ready, and it's very long and detailed, you know, but it was ready, I think, before 9/11. So it is not hard to imagine that they operate by exploiting national emergencies that will make people, I think the theory is that these emergencies will make people more susceptible to their demands. It's Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, basically. Yeah. And 9/11, whether you think they pulled it off themselves or not, they certainly took advantage of it in a major way. And I think that this economic calamity is very similar. You know, their demand that Henry Paulson be made an economic dictator is preposterous. You know, there's no justification for it, really. But in the heat of the moment and under the pressure of the fear of a complete meltdown, it is their expectation that people will go for that. Only time will tell. But unfortunately, that's not the only emergency on the near horizon, you know, these last few weeks before the election. I would like nothing better than for what I'm saying to sound, when people watch this later, like hysteria. I'll accept that. You know, I can live with that if it all turns out to amount to nothing. But I think prudence requires that we note that while there was this economic disaster, there is also something that they haven't been talking about very audibly, and that is a really explosive situation in Pakistan, which seems to be on the verge of an explosion. And there is also clearly something like a revival of the Cold War, as Russia is sending you know, a battleship to Venezuela to conduct joint exercises. And that's, of course, I mean, that was reported by the BBC, not by our media. That has a great deal to do with the, you know, status of our dollar, and whether it will be in the basis of the petrodollar, etc. You know, it's extremely complicated. But the crucial fact, I think, for us as citizens of a very precarious democracy is that emergencies abound, and this regime will take advantage of them, either to intimidate people into voting Republican, you know, or the more likely possibility is that they'll steal the election and then use the emergencies to change the subject, stifle dissent, you know.
And there's also Georgia and south of Ossetia and all that.
Yeah, I don't know how that slipped my mind. I mean, clearly the Georgia crisis has the fingerprints of this regime all over it. And Karl Rove was talking to Saakashvili before it happened. Dick Cheney, subsequent to the episode, was all over the, you know, the stands, you know, those little countries, doing God knows what, up to no good. But I believe it's extremely likely that Georgia invaded South Ossetia on our assurances that we would back them up, you know. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. But all of this, like everything they do, pertains to their subverting our voting system. You know, all of it has to do with distracting people, providing a cover story for surprise victory by their side, etc. That's how they operate. That's what they do. And they don't know how to do normal politics. You know, the press has been, you know, screaming in its collective genes for years about Karl Rove's wizardry, his electoral wizardry. And a lot of Democrats have taken up that I mean, it's a lament, but they think, oh, he's so brilliant at getting out the vote and all this stuff. Well, you know, they never really examined too closely what it might mean to be an electoral wizard. You know, I don't think it involves getting out the vote. What it involves is sort of stubbing out the vote, you know, preventing people from being able to vote, concocting ghost votes or phantom votes for their side, you know, engaging in Jim Crow tactics, all the stuff they do, and concocting rationales to explain their victory. I mean, that's Karl Rove's wizardry. It is not, you know, traditional democratic wizardry. It's something else, you know. And I think, you know, by and by everybody will recognize that. You know, if you start from the premise that this regime stands to lose a tremendous amount if it's deprived of the shelter of the government. You know, if they're knocked away from the helm of the ship of state and they don't have that power anymore, they're highly vulnerable to serious reprisals. You know, I mean, they're going to be prosecuted. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine the number of civil and criminal lawsuits, you know, that they'll have to deal with. They've committed very, very serious crimes, including treason, no doubt. You know, I mean, what's Plamegate but the story of a treasonous action? They are or stand to be in really big trouble. That's my premise. Starting from that premise, that is that they are at serious risk and they cannot afford to be evicted from power, okay? And recognizing their extraordinary ruthlessness, it seems to me that if they can't pull off a credible theft of the election, you know, if somehow Obama's too far ahead, and they can't game it that way, and if they decide that maybe, you know, I even hesitate to say this, like an assassination would be too messy. What's to prevent them from making the situation seem so dangerous that voting has to be postponed, you know? What if there's a terrorist attack on Saturday before Election Day on our soil? A terrorist attack, that's in quotation marks, you know? And 1,000 people get killed in Portland, Oregon, or maybe Houston, to make it more credible. People will be shocked, they'll be terrified, they'll be, you know, susceptible again. I have a feeling that it won't work as well as it worked, you know, in 2001, because you can't keep playing the same tricks over and over again. Still, it is imaginable that if people are sufficiently frightened, they might go along with a postponement of the election. Certainly they're capable of doing it. You know, in a way, the worst thing about what's happened over the last 8 years or so, I mean, worse even than the fact that elections have been subverted and so on, is that our sense of ourselves has been radically distorted. You know, because we tend to assume that the official outcome of the election is an accurate reflection of how people actually think politically, what they want, you know, their preferences and so on. We have tended to believe that we are far more right-wing, more vengeful, more warlike, more, you know, less decent than we really are. I mean, that's the real tragedy here. So if for example, you know, Barack Obama loses, a lot of people will immediately draw the conclusion that the American people are too racist to vote for a black man, right? Well, what if the American people do vote for Barack Obama, in fact, do vote for him, and do vote against McCain, right? So it really is, it's beyond a tragedy for us to get such a radical misimpression of ourselves. Well, we don't have to talk about the next election in these terms. You know, we should really ask the question about what we've been given to understand about ourselves over the course of this last decade. we're supposed to believe that we are pro-war, that we are obsessed with being tough on crime, that we are highly moralistic, that we're extremely homophobic, that we're disgusted with civil rights, you know, that we believe in corporate power, that we don't believe in a woman's right to choose. I could go on and on, you know. We are encouraged to believe that the last few elections really do tell us who we are, when in fact, you know, all the available evidence, you know, all the statistical evidence, all the studies of how Americans really feel about these issues makes quite clear that the American people are, you know, by a considerable majority actually committed to or believe in, you know, a kind of progressive agenda. Whether you're talking about abortion rights or global warming or the minimum wage or Social Security or the war in Iraq, you know, or open and observable vote counts, you know. I mean, most people would prefer, I mean, there was Zogby did a poll, it was commissioned by Paul Lato, the election integrity attorney, and they put the question, you know, do you believe in an open and observable vote counting system? And 92% of those polled said yes, you know. All right, so maybe it's 70%. I mean, what's the difference? The fact is that on all these issues, people are sane, you know. They have let's call it an enlightened sense of self-interest. You don't have to get all sentimental about it, but they're not committed to the kind of fervently pro-war, quasi-theocratic agenda, you know, the corporatist agenda of the Bush-Cheney regime. They're just not. Now, the question is, why doesn't this find any political expression? You know, why is it a matter of election activists trying to sift the real outcomes of the elections and pollsters, sociologists who study public opinion? Why do we have to infer how we the people really feel about all these issues? Well, it's because the entire political system has been gamed, right? Let me broaden that. The entire establishment is a kind of collective betrayal of the American people's true desires. It gives a systematic kind of misimpression of where people stand. And that's because the two political parties are equally fixated on the big bucks of their corporate donors. You know, it has to do with the corruption of the political system. It has to do with the fact that, you know, you buy a certain amount of political power so that the more money you have, the more political sway you have. The people who argue that the American people are really stupid and credulous are themselves credulous. I won't say they're stupid, but I'm saying they're credulous, and they're, you know, I actually think that in many cases the people who make that argument get a sort of secret pleasure out of condemning the majority because it makes them feel superior. You know, I mean, a lot of people abroad prefer to think that we actually have voted for Bush. You know, they're kind of resistant to the contrary evidence because they like to see us as that stupid. It has to do with, you know, kind of deep anti-Americanism. They want to feel superior to us. And a lot of people on the left are the same way. They're just as elitist, you know. They get a kick out of that idea. People are so dumb. You know, those hicks are so stupid. They don't understand their own self-interest, blah, 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 you know. Well, I mean, that's a profoundly credulous assessment because it's based on the view that, first of all, what we see in the media is an absolute reflection of how people really are, you know, and it isn't. You know, the stuff that's on TV is there to suit the advertisers. You know, it's not a direct reflection of public taste. And our elections are fixed. You know, they're fixed at great expense and on an enormous scale. I mean, they have to be, you know, in order to decide the elections the way they've been decided. It takes a tremendous amount of hard work by a lot of people and a lot of money. Therefore, to say that, oh, there you go, see how it turned out, see, I told you people were idiots, you know. Well, I mean, if we think that people are generally that stupid, right, then we should just, for the sake of intellectual honesty, become fascists, right? because that's the most efficient way to govern idiots, right? Or you could just say authoritarian. It doesn't have to be fascism per se. It could be a Hobbesian, government of some kind or other, right? But if, on the other hand, you think that people generally tend to make sensible decisions, if they're presented with enough information, as I believe that that's true,
Lakoff disagrees, right?
Who?
Lakoff.
Well, I like George Lakoff's work, but I think that, in its recent political application, he has a vested interest in flogging the argument that the problem is framing. See, I've discussed this with him. We've argued about this, and his mind is open to the possibility that the election's been stolen, but he has a theory, and when you have a theory, you tend to overlook aspects of reality that make the theory, untenable. And that's true of so many people, I mean, look, to be in the punditocracy at all is to be paid to come up with explanations, simple, comforting explanations. And what's a more comforting explanation than to say to people, you and I know that the problem is the rest of them. You and I know that they're too thick-witted to understand their own best interests. That's the Tom Frank argument. You and I know that people are just too anti-intellectual to vote for a guy like Obama. You and I know that because we're smart. You and I know that the American people are basically racists. Not like us. We're not racists. I've perished the thought. These are all. They're comforting because they're flattering. Flatter you. Well, what,
Yes, I think they're helping with the polls that are distorted. Don't you think the current polls are distorted?
The polls are indeed distorted. On HuffPost there was a piece noting that the spate of polls that put McCain ahead of Obama, were based on an oversampling of Republicans by like 10 points. Now, I mean, the pollsters have a good reason for doing this. But that aside, it has the effect of distorting the picture, Plus, as many people have noted, built into the polling enterprise is this failure to deal with people who use cell phones. So that's something that's, it's a bit dated in the whole exercise of polling, and it's going to have a particular effect on our image of how Obama and McCain are doing, because Obama's supporters tend to be younger, cell phone users, etc. The media then has its own vested interest, and they always love to make the race look like it's tightening up, because that has us on the edge of our seats and so on. But again, people look at these polls, they say, see, I told you Americans are idiots, See, I told you they're going to love Sarah Palin. I heard this all the time. I was a brilliant pick, because she's outspoken and she's anti-intellectual, and people like that, Well, there's really no evidence that people like that stuff. Remember, we always used to hear that Gore was too cerebral and wooden, and Bush was the guy you'd like to have a beer with, right? And Bush is the guy that Bubba likes. All right, I have no doubt that a lot of Bubbas liked Bush, but the fact is that all those people who are, rambling on so confidently about Bubba, don't know Bubba, they don't hang out with Bubba. They have lunch at Lutece, you know what I'm saying? They make a lot of money from media corporations. People like Tom Friedman, for example, who writes a column in the New York Times saying that Obama has got to connect with Joe Sixpack at the gut level. What does Tom Friedman know about Joe Sixpack's gut? He knows nothing about it, nothing at all. I mean, this is so richly condescending, it just takes your breath away, you know what I mean? And this guy's the big champion of free trade, and he's talking about Joe Sixpack's gut. Anyway, I'm really sick of all this sort of polite elitism, this contempt for the collective intelligence of the American people. It's an old pose. I mean, people have argued it goes all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, But I don't really see any alternative to respecting the intelligence of the American people. And that means that, you know, we need not only to fix the voting system, I mean, that needs to be radically reformed, but we also need media reform. I mean, thorough, revolutionary media reform. Break down it's basically a trust, you know, it's what Tom Frank calls a culture trust. We have to break it down. We can't allow that kind of concentration. You know, you can't allow General Electric to dominate or have such a loud voice in the area of news. You know, it's just completely improper. And we don't have a public broadcasting system. It's not a public system what we have. It's something else. We need media reform. If people are fed a constant diet of triviality and lies, right? It's going to leave their minds weak. It's going to cause them to misjudge the situation. Say, it's not because they're stupid. It's because they're kept in the dark, you know? So if you respect the intelligence of the people, you not only provide them with a viable voting system, but you tell them what they need to know, you know? You make it possible for them to speak to each other, you know, which is something that our establishment just absolutely doesn't want. So aside from election reform and media reform, finally, you also need campaign finance reform, because our system is thoroughly corrupt, you know. It's like the Roman Empire or something. So that's the kind of trilogy, the holy trinity of things that we very badly need. You know, once we get something like that, you know, then we start talking about proportional representation and making it possible for there to be more than just the two parties, you know. But I'm kind of veering off the point here, but, you know, a third party is not a solution at this point. It just can't be. Because in a winner-take-all system where the election apparatus is corrupt and hacked, third parties always work to the psychological advantage of the more ruthless of the two main parties, see. So Al Gore can, you know, his loss, his defeat in Florida in 2000 can be blamed on Ralph Nader, see. So the problem with Nader's candidacy was not that he siphoned votes away from Al Gore. I've never respected that argument. The problem is that he allowed the establishment to say that's why Gore lost, because Gore didn't lose in Florida in 2000, which too few people know. He didn't lose, so he couldn't have been robbed of his election by Ralph Nader, you know. But the point is that whether it's Ralph Nader or Cynthia McKinney or Bob Barr or whoever it is, you know, in our system, third parties tend to be exercises in a kind of self-indulgence. I think they can really make a great difference locally. I'm all for them locally. But until we, you know, begin to grapple with these huge structural problems, it's very dangerous, you know. A lot of liberals think that the function of the religious right is simply to be used by corporate interests. I mean, this is Chomsky's argument, and it's an argument you hear a lot, that the Christianists, you know, the theocratic element within the Republican Party is simply being manipulated by far more rational actors whose motivations are economic. So Chomsky will say, you know, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld are not religious men. Well, true enough, that's true. They're not. They represent the neoconservative bloc within the Bush machine. But their relationship to the Christian right is not simply the relationship of the puppet master to the puppet. It's much more complicated than that. They really do depend on the religious right as foot soldiers, and very often as technicians in you know, the whole apparatus of election fraud. In fact, most of the primary operators in the machine that's dedicated to actually gaming the vote electronically, most of those people are ardent theocrats and radically anti-choice. You know, really, I mean, they're sincere. I'm not going to fault them for insincerity. They're not cynical. you could say that the neocons are cynical in their use of these elements. But these elements are not cynical. And it is true that often the corporate project trumps, you know, the Christianist project in many ways. However, first of all, a lot of the big money behind the Bush machine comes from people, fabulously wealthy people, who are sincere theocrats themselves. If you look at the Council for National Policy, which is the steering committee of the religious right, which vetted Sarah Palin's candidacy, you got a lot of serious money there. People like Howard Amundsen and Richard DeVos and Tom Monahan, the founder of Domino's Pizza, you know, who started Ave Maria Law School. I mean, these are people who really do believe in creating a generation of theocratic cadres who will, you know, basically work to replace the Constitution with you know, the book of Leviticus. Well, this is stuff that you can laugh off. You can say, nobody believes that. That's crazy. Well, the fact is that in many, many ways, the theocrats have made tremendous strides in changing the culture for a lot of people in this country, you know, even though it may not be immediately evident when you're watching CNN. I mean, for example, so they haven't overturned Roe v. Wade. Okay. Well, actually, they intend to try to make contraception illegal, and they have made it unavailable to a lot of people. They have made accurate scientific information about birth control unavailable to a lot of people. They have, in various ways, made abortions unavailable to poor women in this country. You know, I mean, throughout vast stretches of the rural United States, there are no more abortion clinics. And this is a consequence of a kind of activism at many different levels involving, including terrorism, right? I mean, people are just afraid to work at these places. Well, I mean, that's a successful theocratic enterprise. That affects people. That affects them in their daily lives, you know. The creation of an Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, which you know, Barack Obama wants to expand. You know, this represents a victory for the theocratic wing of this regime, okay? So the telecom industry and the pharmaceutical industry and all these other big, huge industries, they make out like bandits. It is true. And ultimately, there's a huge contradiction between what the corporatists want, you know, and what the theocrats want, right? Because like the theocrats would make pornography illegal. And where would that leave AT&T, you know? I mean, how many people log on to watch porn online? A lot of people. That's a lot of money. So, I mean, their interests are mutually contradictory, yes. But it's still a gross exaggeration to say that the theocratic, you know, program is simply a political football that's being used purely cynically. It is not just that.